This is another episode that I don't place where the viewing order that I'm using places it. I'm using the Amazon.com viewing order for the series. If you guys are curious, you can go check it out to kind of get a feel for how I'm going to be organizing episodes from this point forward. But this is another one that I don't like where it tends to be placed. A lot of viewing orders place this after the two-part episode that I call the season finale of Season 1. And yet they still call this a part of Season 1, making it the Season 1 finale, and that just falls flat for me. So I'm placing it here before that two-part episode. That is not to say that I think this episode is bad or anything. I just want to make that clear before we move on. As Cyborg finishes construction of his T-car, even going so far as to bring it online using a component from himself, a computer chip of sorts. He announces it to his friends and gets super excited about taking them for a drive, and they're excited about it too, but they don't treat the situation as seriously as he does, and he kind of gets bummed out, which leads to some scenes of really solid comedy. Cyborg treats this situation with reverence, and the rest of them are just treating it like a fun drive with their friends, which makes sense. Mid-annoyance, though, Robin does insist that they stop a crime being committed by a person named Overload. And I say person, acknowledging that I use that term loosely, because Overload is actually just a form made of electricity that vaguely resembles a person and has a red computer chip at its core, which is the actual Overload, which seems to be about the same shape and size as the computer chip that Cyborg used earlier to bring the T-car online. I wonder if that's gonna come into play later. Anyway, they pass a couple of 1950s-esque greasers on the way in. The Titans, of course, defeat Overload and capture him, ready to hand off to the police to send to jail. But in the meantime, those two 1950s-esque greasers manage to steal the T-car despite all of Cyborg's high-tech security, which means he probably should look into the effectiveness of that security. He, of course, wants to go after his car, but Robin insists that the Titans have to remain with Overload so that they can hand him off to the police successfully. Cyborg, though, is obsessing over this car. He will have none of that, so he goes after it instead and leaves the other four to clean up the mess. Seeing as how he's looking for a pair of 1950s greasers, he of course heads to their natural habitat, a 1950s drive-up diner, and is directed to a racing location that they were supposedly looking to race at, called Kraish Canyon, which I'm sure gives Cyborg the warm and fuzzies. He rushes off to said Kraish Canyon and discovers that the two greasers have just had the car stolen from them by Gizmo, one of the Hive members from the episode that I place first in my viewing order. He apparently needs a fast getaway vehicle for a job he's pulling downtown, which gives Cyborg his next lead. He does find Gizmo, and he does confront him, jumping onto the hood of the car. But because Cyborg is so obsessed with not damaging this car, he can't take it back from Gizmo because he can't risk damaging it himself. Instead, he just hangs onto the hood and lets Gizmo drive around and cause the exact kind of damage that he's trying to avoid. It's really sad, honestly. Like, Cyborg's obsession with this car at the beginning was played for laughs, and it was actually funny. And honestly, even in this scene, it's still kind of funny. There's a funny aspect to his behavior, but you're also left thinking, this guy is a superhero, and he's being forced into inaction by his obsession with a vehicle. And it seems that Cyborg, after the fact, feels much the same way, because after Gizmo finally gets away, he heads back to the same diner from before to sulk about his inability to get the car back. It's actually Raven that helps him out, who helps him to overcome this sense of self-pity that seems to have overcome him. She shows up there and reveals that the others, as soon as they handed Overload off, split up and began looking for the T-car, and she just happened to stumble upon him while they were doing that. Raven was the one out of the Titans who least understood why Cyborg loved this car so much. She just genuinely doesn't really care about cars, and so she doesn't get it. Or at least she didn't. It seems that with time to actually think about it, she's started to understand. Keep in mind, she is an empath, after all. She can sense other people's feelings. She has, in the interim, realized that Cyborg literally put himself into that car. Not just through the chip, but through all the time he spent assembling her. And it reminds her of how she has to put a little bit of herself into everything that she moves with her powers. She can actually understand how he feels. And so she sits down and she talks to him and helps to validate his feelings. It's a very powerful scene, made even more powerful by the fact that immediately after Cyborg gets his mojo back, immediately after he comes to realize that his feelings are valid, that his attachment to this car is valid, Raven actually points out that the car is here. Gizmo has driven it back for whatever reason. They have a chance to pursue him now, and when they notice that the same 1950s greasers who stole it in the first place are also coincidentally back at the same diner, having escaped before police could take custody of them. Which, as an aside, actually kind of proves what Robin was saying earlier, that a Titan should always stay with the criminal they capture to make sure the police get them. Oops. Because they're there, Cyborg is basically able to coerce them into letting him borrow their car because they stole his car and they owe him. And despite the fact that it's just a regular muscle car, a really nice muscle car, but a regular muscle car versus a super high-tech tricked out car with more tech in it than Kit from Knight Rider. Gizmo's just not a very good driver, and Cyborg is, and he has Raven with her vast telekinetic abilities to assist him. They catch up with the car easily, but unfortunately in doing so, they push Gizmo into the wrong lane, into oncoming traffic, and he panics, abandoning the car rather than maneuvering it out of the way of a prison transport truck, which crashes into it and totals it. And it just so happens that it's the exact same prison transport truck that is transporting Overload. He escapes from the crashed truck and takes over the T-car by plugging himself into the same chip port that Cyborg first used to bring the car online. Cyborg is no longer a literal part of this car, Overload is. And faced with the threat of a true villain using all of the tech on that car to commit atrocities, Cyborg doesn't hesitate. He blasts it apart. And through a combination of excellent staging, excellent animation on Cyborg's facial features, and a great performance by voice actor Carrie Payton, you could just feel the emotional weight of the situation. Yeah, it was just a car, but it was important to this character, and the staging makes you feel what he feels, makes you feel the loss that he feels. And because the staging of the scene does such a good job of making you feel what he's feeling, making you feel the loss that he's feeling, the scene just, it resonates really well. It's so poignant. The car is completely destroyed, and Cyborg chose to be the one to do it. He didn't have to. Raven was there too, but he made that choice. He cared about that car enough to make the choice to destroy it rather than let it be associated with bad things. Faced with this loss, his first instinct is to deny his attachment to what is effectively a very large inanimate object. But once again, Raven is there to remind him that his feelings are valid and that the car is worth putting back together. That the car itself is just parts, it's everything else that makes it his baby. So he recovers the chip that he first used to activate it and puts the car back together. Raven even helping him do so despite her lack of interest in cars, because she may lack interest in cars, but she does care about her friend. This is such a great episode. The comedy in it really lands. It's goofy, but still a lot of fun. Cyborg being so over the top early on in this episode to facilitate that comedy actually has an emotional resonance later, because eventually his over the top obsession with this car turns into something detrimental to him, and he has to learn how to balance that with actually being a superhero. There's great involvement from Raven here, who seems on the surface to be the least likely character to help Cyborg through all of this, but when you really think about it, of course she's the one who would help him through this. It works so well because it's not immediately obvious. And it serves as great character development for both her and Cyborg without actually spoon-feeding to us what development they're receiving. There is no spelled-out message of this episode, but you can still read one into it. That it's okay to love a thing. It's okay to project a little bit of yourself onto an object, just so long as you don't go too far with it. I mentioned that despite the fact that some viewing orders place this episode after the two-part episode, The Apprentice, I place it before it. I understand why it's probably placed after. It's probably placed after to be some levity after such a heavy episode, but I just don't like that. I said before that this episode can be placed pretty much anywhere in the series, and that's true, but I don't like placing it immediately after The Apprentice because I don't want it to be overshadowed by that admittedly better episode. This episode is great too, but if you place it after such a serious two-part episode that affects the characters so much, especially if you place it after that two-parter in the same season, people are going to come into this episode expecting some kind of follow-up to the two-parter, and they're going to come out disappointed. And that's not something that this episode deserves. It deserves much better than that. As per usual, though, I'd like to know what you guys think of this episode if you have seen it. Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.